Hi, and welcome to this presentation on learners with specific learning disabilities. Sometimes these students are referred to as having SLD, or specific learning disability, and sometimes learning disability, or LD. Though, either way, we mean the same thing. This is a heterogeneous group of individuals who typically have normal intelligence, and that's key to this disability. The cognitive levels are within normal and average range, but these students fail to learn as easily and efficiently as their classmates and peers, despite having the same opportunities to learn and receive an education. Okay, this is the largest category of children served in special education, and nearly half of all students with an IEP. This is not to be confused with an intellectual disability. We're going to talk about that category in a later module. But I just want to emphasize that a learning disability is not a general term for someone with special education or a person with a disability. People with learning disabilities do have a specific criteria to meet to be eligible for special education as having that specific learning disability. Okay, but over the years, there have been some problems with defining and finding eligibility for students with learning disabilities. But what it boils down to, the state decision on how that is defined. Here you have the technical definition in IDEA. Specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And this includes conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Learning disabilities do not include learning problems that are not primarily a result of visual, hearing, motor problems, or intellectual disabilities. Well, here it says mental retardation. That's just the old term that was replaced with intellectual disability back in 2009. Emotional disturbance, or an environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. So please note that this is the definition. You should learn it. You are going to have students with learning disabilities if you teach students in the general curriculum. It's not the same thing as having an intellectual disability. In terms of causal factors, there are a lot of proposed factors, but overall it's primarily believed to be influenced by genetics or heredity, possibly brain trauma or environmental factors or teratogens, exposure during pregnancy, but there's really no consensus or one cause of learning disability. Some of the learning and behavioral characteristics exhibited by individuals with learning disabilities include poor attention or poor motor skills, psychological processing deficits, short and long-term memory problems, impaired metacognition, or language reading difficulties, phonological awareness deficits, written language or mathematical quantitative problems, and social skill deficits. Let's take a look at the profile of a young lady named Grace. Grace is 8 years old. Grace had a fairly normal developmental history prior to school, with a few noted difficulties in engaging with peers and attending. Once in school, teachers noticed that she continued to take longer to complete work and remain focused. She also began to struggle with spelling and math and vocabulary. As these difficulties grew, Grace started feeling frustrated and decreased motivation to go to school, as you can imagine. But she still enjoyed reading and learning. Once what began with getting more intensive support in a multi-tiered support system, and data were just not showing that Grace was making sufficient progress. So they conducted an evaluation to look at her patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Well, her IQ test of cognitive skills showed high average skills in verbal comprehension, as well as perceptual reasoning, with noted deficits in working memory. And her achievement scores, as expected by her classroom, based on her classroom performance, were in the low average to average range. Now in Georgia, students must show deficits in psychological processing, including attending and memory, And once that's documented, there must be evidence that the deficit has impaired the child's mastery of an academic task, with a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. 12 weeks of evidence-based practice instruction and data must show that even with supplementary instructional strategies, there is a lack of effect. In addition, she showed significant differences in her scores in inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity, learning problems, and executive functioning, which are also characteristics of students with learning disabilities, along with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what does that mean to you? Would she meet the eligibility for special education services? Are there other categories that she might be eligible for special education? Here at the end, I want to talk about 3 terms that you may have heard. Currently, school systems don't diagnose these specific disorders. They're going to be more clinical diagnosis. They're dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. They would all be considered a learning disability. Not all learning disabilities are dyslexia, but dyslexia is a learning disability. So let's start with dysgraphia. What is it? Well, it's not being able to write letters automatically. Not being able to write letters, spell, but being able to read at the same time. So someone with dysgraphia can read, but has difficulty with writing and spelling, or just using that orthographic loop of being able to form letters and written words with output through the hand. See if you can read this. Pause the video and see if you can read it. The student needs technology to communicate in writing. Normally, the student uses what we call an AlphaSmart, which is a wireless keyboard, basically, for students to, or a wireless word processor device, so students can type and overcome obstacles presented with dysgraphia. So pause and look, because the next slide is the typed version. Okay, so with technology, this student really can communicate. Dyslexia is the core deficit in phonological processing loop, which is being able to see a sound, connect it to, see a letter and connect it to the sound, or hear a sound and identify the letter. So dyslexia impacts reading from being able to make connections between letters and sounds and using executive function to process those connections. It's both a reading and writing disorder. Both reading and writing can be impacted by dyslexia. Here's an example of a person who tried to communicate in writing. It took him 14 minutes to write the sentence. See if you can read it. The summer is coming. This is a busy time of the year for me. My wife and I have to get the truck and the trailer for the season. Normally, it should not take someone 14 minutes to generate that sentence. Okay, and lastly, because reading and arithmetic are similar in many ways, numbers and words stand for concepts, a child with language difficulty is likely to have difficulty learning to calculate. So in review, children with specific learning disabilities are our highest incidence population of students receiving special education and are generally served in inclusive general education classrooms for the majority of the day, working on general curriculum standards and accommodations and supplementary aids and services used to support their learning.